It is a crazy day for Cyberpunk 2077 news. Earlier today was the earnings call for CD Projekt Red for Q1 2022, and in this they actually shared a bunch of new details around Cyberpunk's future, specifically on the expansions, what employees are working on, and even some transitions going on with the company. And this in its own right is big news, a ton of interesting information to go over. But just out of pure coincidence, seemingly, we also got a leak of the first expansion of Cyberpunk, and really the entire thing. The whole expansion leaked, the entire story component. And it's this incredibly bizarre but also very interesting situation that a lot of people are getting wrong on the internet or just curious about. So in this video, I'm going to talk about all of that. There's a lot of very interesting stuff to go over. And specifically when it comes to those leaks, I did the deep dive. I reached out to a bunch of people and I got the real story of what is going on with this first expansion leak. But first, let's look at the Q1 earnings report from CD Projekt Red, where they go over a bunch of interesting things. They mentioned and even show this graph as to how patch 1.5 and the next gen update had a major positive impact on both the sales and perception of Cyberpunk. You can see here how there's a fairly major increase in sales following the release of this patch, and in particular you'll see a lot more people buying on PlayStation and Xbox. And they actually describe how they believe many more console players are to be reached, and there is a goal with patch 1.6 that is coming at some point later this year to reach those console players. Now it's not entirely clear what they mean by this. Is there going to be specific things in that patch targeting consoles that will enhance the experience on last gen or current gen? I'm guessing probably more current gen than last gen, but it seems like with the console market in particular, they want to expand things. As far as where this patch is or even just when it's coming, we don't really know. There's been some movements and changes on the Steam depot, so you can see some builds being updated over the past couple of weeks, but nothing concrete. Those are just loose indications that things are being worked on, and frankly, I don't know if the patch is a week away or 2 months away. We're kind of in a weird period with the game overall, which speaking of, we also get a developer breakdown. We can see how the Cyberpunk expansion is the vast majority of this company at this point. There are a lot of people working on this first expansion, or just really the expansion for the game. But you can see when it comes to continued support for this game through patches and updates, the amount of people here has actually shrunk considerably. We're at less than half of where we were at the end of 2021, and they mention how part of the team servicing Cyberpunk was actually moved to other projects in the past quarter. Naturally, this is expected as the game gets older and the updates are kind of less needed in a sense. People are going to move on to adding new things or just even other projects at the company, but it further serves to reinforce this idea that the biggest Cyberpunk updates are behind us. At this point, I imagine things like a police overhaul, if they're coming at all, will be a part of the expansion-related update and not actually patch 1.6. Patch 1.6 will inevitably be fairly large, as there is a considerable amount of dev time going into it, but I would not expect anything on the scale of patch 1.3 or 1.5, simply because there's just way less developers on this part of the game. They're not abandoning Cyberpunk, they're just actually working on the expansion. Which, speaking of the expansion, we get some updates around this. They mentioned how in the second half of 2022, we're going to be getting the Witcher 3 Next Gen, but also the Cyberpunk Edgerunner show and Cyberpunk expansion marketing. This is actually fairly big news. The second half of 2022 will start on July 1st, and to me this does suggest that the expansion is coming relatively early in 2023. If marketing's starting in 2022, that being this year, it's not like the expansion's coming in summer or late 2023, right? CDPR was very reluctant and basically outright refused to give any further details beyond this, even during the Q&A section of the earnings call, but they do mention overall how they are happy with how production is progressing on this Cyberpunk expansion. I know though, nothing's really concretely confirmed here. Considering CDPR has been gradually shifting towards this short reveal to release window, and even with patch 1.5 and the next gen version, that was literally the same day between reveal and release, it makes me think that the expansion is coming pretty early in 2023. This is pure speculation by me, but I think if you look at what the company has been trending towards, that is heavily suggested by this. Although this also does confirm something else in that Cyberpunk probably won't be at the Microsoft Summer Showcase. That showcase is in June, and Half 2 kicks off with July 1st. Although the Game Awards in December seem like a great time for a trailer to drop on that first expansion, and it's also worth noting here that CDPR has continued to only say expansion. I pointed this out in a previous video, but in the past they were pretty consistently saying expansions when talking about Cyberpunk, that being the plural. And they even described in the past how it'll have the same or more DLC compared to The Witcher 3. And although nothing has been explicitly confirmed, I really think this this game is only going to be getting one expansion. And even kind of further evidence of that somewhat, they also describe how the Cyberpunk expansion will be the last product on Red Engine. The next Witcher game will seemingly be the first project to kick off the Unreal Engine development. This also actually seems to be more evidence that Cyberpunk multiplayer is dead. There's no mention of it at all during this call. But on the topic of using Unreal Engine going forward, they mention how they see improvements in efficiency already and in their creative process, and also how they're working with Epic programmers to ensure the engine is scaled to their needs. In Q1 of 2022, pre-production on the new Witcher game began, and there's over 100 developers involved at this point. And lastly, they describe how Unreal Engine support should lead to more smooth production that is secure and predictable, but not necessarily faster. Their games will likely still take the similar amount of time to actually release, but hopefully this time that means less delays overall. So that was the earnings call and some of the major details shared during that. But on the other side, we have this very curious and very interesting leak situation. With patch 1.5, CD Projekt Red accidentally added files to Cyberpunk 2077 that effectively spoiled the first expansion. Several days after patch 1.5 dropped, a couple of data miners found some unhashed bin files. You couldn't just open these regularly, but upon trying a few things, they discovered that when converting them and then opening them in Notepad, it revealed a bunch of text basically just pertaining to expansion 1. And that's really what we're seeing today. Those are the files that have leaked. But you might be sitting there wondering, okay, but why didn't they leak immediately? Patch 1.5 came out 3 months ago. Why are we only seeing this now? Well, basically, immediately upon discovering this, they realized that it was a major spoiler, not wanting to ruin the new high CDPR was on after patch 1.5 and the next-gen update being such a success. They worked to make sure this didn't publicly drop, even going as far as to reach out to CDPR and popular public modding tools to avoid this being discovered by others or leaking further. The tool in question was actually with the devs of Wolvenkit. They're trying to get them to delay a certain update to that tool because if that update went through, it would make discovering the files a lot easier and just more accessible overall. Seemingly that update did go through but was quickly reverted. And actually, if you think back, do you remember that very mysterious and bizarre patch we got to Cyberpunk that had no patch notes? Well, it seems like that was actually these data miners reaching out to CDPR to try and get these files removed from the game, and it was partially successful, as seemingly many of the files were removed from the game with that patch, but not all of them, and a few actually still remain. But as to how this all came to be today, it basically seems like there was some drama or controversy along the way. Different treatment of others who are using the leaked data that from the big leak CDPR had last year versus some of these data miners and just some of the controversy among some of the moderators in the community. With it more or less boiling down to, after months of frustration, there are some disagreements that eventually led to this all being shared publicly. And I mean, yeah, that's kind of the situation. Definitely a bizarre one where it's basically a Discord fight led to a giant leak happening for Cyberpunk. I know though that is one way to look at it. I guess the real story here is that a leak happened to Cyberpunk on accident all the way back with patch 1.5. It's just only leaking publicly and properly now. The data mining scene for Cyberpunk just isn't that big, so this was able to be kept under wraps for a while. But with that in mind, what we're looking at here is basically a bunch of raw dialogue and various files for the game. Most of the time being conversations between V and other characters that you will be able to have throughout the entirety of this expansion. But although this leak is legit, it also should be taken somewhat with a grain of salt, as obviously it's fairly old, leaking with patch 1.5 about 3 months ago, but even further, the expansion itself may not come out until a year after these files were found. And even in the files themselves, there are several placeholders, so all of this is very subject to change, but I have to imagine the major story beats will probably stay the same. So looking at the actual leaks themselves, I'm not going to spoil anything major, but I'm going to look at some of the introductory quests and give a rough idea of what's actually going on here. There'll be a bunch of additional content outside of the main expansion story. Nearly all of the fixers will be getting some new dialogue. You'll have access to new jobs with Mr. Hands, and there are even entries for content unlocking after V gets access to the combat zone, which more on that in a moment. There are a bunch of entries for things known as mini world stories, not really clear what these are, but a bunch of new interactions in the world is what it seems like, as well as 13 new street stories as side missions to complete that involve all kinds of minor things to do around Night City. You can dive deeply into all of that. There's a ton of dialogue to dig into, but the main takeaway is this is not just a main story expansion. It seems like this will actually add a healthy amount of content to the world overall. But looking at that main story, it'll involve us getting hacked by a mysterious character named Songbird that will claim to be able to help us, specifically around the relic, and request we go to the combat zone. It seems like they may have a bit of a forceful nature in making making us go to the combat zone. There's going to be a new location added onto Pacifica. It seems like it'll actually be the opening up of some of the existing locations in Pacifica that are largely unused. In the combat zone, the militia holds power, with corporations pretty much staying away from this area. And reportedly, the relic in our head has an untapped potential we were not using. And it seems like for a while here, Johnny is actually kind of turned off, and Songbird will replace them during some of these introductory quests. We spent some time getting into the combat zone with the help of Songbird, but once inside, a shuttle will crash, blocking our exit path, and we discover on board that shuttle was the president of NUSA, this being the new United States of America, and we're going to rush to that shuttle and actually help out Rosalind Myers, who is the current president and will be playing a major role in this DLC. There'll be a decent chunk of gameplay where you are playing along and kind of buddy-buddy with the president. You'll actually be fighting a Chimera Militech mech that seemingly will be a new addition to Cyberpunk, but will actually be a bit of a boss fight. You'll then proceed into some subway tunnels and make your escape, chased by a variety of other enemies and having to fight your way out. From there, you're going to meet a bunch of new characters, naturally the things you would expect from a DLC. It seems like you will befriend and start to team up with the NUSA somewhat. You will go to what I think is a new location with the container zone. Perhaps this is a misspelling of the combat zone, or even just in the combat zone. Within, we're going to talk to some voodoo boys, and we're going to get some more formal interactions with Mr. Hands. All of this in search for Songbird. Although she plays a major part in the first part of the quest, it seems like we kind of lose contact and then are trying to figure out where she is or how to get to her in the second or kind of middle parts. There's going to be almost another heist-esque section. We're going to be going into Hotel Paradise at a party, and you'll even be role-playing as a couple with one of the other new characters with Reed, or at least many people mistake you as a couple, and you could lean into that if you'd like. And that's kind of the introductory portion to this. There are several more quests that will go into the deeper side. That's really just looking at the first 3 or 4 quests, of which it seems like there'll be 7 in total. Now, there's a healthy amount of new content here. I spent a long time even just reading and going through the dialogue I shared with you, and there's a lot more to dive into that I went through somewhat. I'll have a link down below to the post if you want to check this all out for yourself. Although one thing that is worth highlighting is it does seem like this will add an alternate option to one of the endings of the game. Doesn't seem like it's a new ending entirely, but with one of the existing endings, you'll have new options based off what Songbird promises. So overall, it definitely seems interesting. It's kind of hard to gauge how this will all play out. And overall, it gets me excited for the first expansion. I mean, I was pretty much excited either way. CDPR are known for phenomenal expansions, and it does seem like this could be another one. With that said, that is a fairly interesting video covering 2 completely separate yet somewhat related things, and a big news day for Cyberpunk. Hopefully you guys found this one informative. I actually have a couple of additional Cyberpunk videos on the way around a big mystery with the game, but even further looking at some of the new mods that are actually really starting to change things up. As always, again, I thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this one, and I hope to see you all next time. Later.